All right, so today we are going to do the last system, reproductive. Simultaneously, both the most and least important system of the body. And that's going to cover all of the new material for the course. So on Wednesday, we'll have a review session for the last exam that'll cover the digestive and urinary and reproductive systems. And then next Monday, there will be a review for the final exam, which will be next Wednesday. Okay, so goal today is to get through this new material, and then the rest of what we do will be review. So we're going to start by taking a very brief look at the development of our reproductive organs, kind of for the same reason that we do it in the nervous system, where I showed you a little bit of stuff. It just kind of helps to understand how, you know, this one system where we actually have these major differences between sexes, how they still start from the same place. So when development starts, everybody's the same. And it's not until about 9 weeks of age that we can actually start telling the difference between male and female reproductive organs, because up until that point, they are identical. So in that third month of life, that's that 9 to 12 weeks, that's when basically the presence or absence of testosterone is going to determine which reproductive organs actually get developed. So up until that point, we're calling them bipotential gonads because they can become male or female gonads. And there's a set of two different tubes that essentially go down from those gonads to an opening. And before digestive and urinary and reproductive system development, we just call that opening a cloaca. It's a single opening. You don't need to know that, but just to kind of clarify that. So in male fetuses, there's going to be a Y chromosome. And that Y chromosome is going to cause the secretion of testosterone, the male sex hormone, although both men and women do make testosterone, men make it in much higher amounts. And under the influence of testosterone, one of the sets of tubes, which are called Müllerian ducts, they disappear. And the other set of tubes, which is called, they're called Wolffian ducts, they become the vas deferens, which is the tube that connects the testes to the urethra, which we'll cover today. The gonads become testes under the influence of testosterone, and the cloaca is going to develop into a urethra and a rectum because those are the two output openings that men have. So in female fetuses, there's no Y chromosome, so there's no testosterone. And without testosterone, the ducts that became the vas deferens, they're the ones that degenerate. And the other ones that went away in the presence of testosterone, they become the internal organs of the female reproductive system, so the uterine tubes and the uterus. And the cloaca not only becomes the urethra and the rectum, so for both the urinary and digestive system outlets, but also becomes the vagina, the outlet for female reproductive organs. So that's kind of in a nutshell how we all start the same and then become two different possible outcomes. So this is kind of the same thing, but with a view externally, showing with color coding how these things become different things again. So again, we start with kind of all the same stuff externally, and under the influence of testosterone, we're going to form this single cloacal outlet into an anus, and the urethra forms here, and the penis forms like that. And then the same tissues in a female are going to form the labial lips, the vaginal opening, the clitoris, and still the anus and the urethra. So we'll cover all of these adult organs as we go through today, but just kind of showing you it all kind of starts the same. And it's not actually that uncommon for things to not quite go right. So intersex is what we call someone when their reproductive organs are neither completely male or female, and typically it's caused by some sort of error in that developmental process. There's a lot more to it than that, obviously, but when we look at the either end of that developmental spectrum, we can kind of see how people can end up in between. So that's all this is showing, is kind of how you can end up in between. Okay, so all of this then is what you're born with. And for the most part, it stays the same during childhood. Everything grows, but everything's growing proportionally. And then the reproductive system is the major system that actually changes during puberty, because all of your other systems, they just kind of get bigger as you get older until you hit maturity. But the reproductive system goes through this whole series of like readiness steps, where you go from being a child and being completely immature reproductively and not being able to reproduce, and then you go through puberty and now you're reproductively mature. And I'm sure you're all aware of that because pretty much all of us have gone through that. But you probably didn't know about the hormones that were involved, and we've started learning about those because we covered the endocrine system. And so those same hormones that we touched on in the endocrine system that have an impact on the reproductive system are the ones that trigger puberty as well. So as you get older, your hypothalamus is going to be the one that kind of kicks things into action, and it's going to do that by releasing GnRH, which is the gonadotropin releasing hormone. So it releases that goes through the little portal system that connects the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and we get release of LH and FSH. So in the male, and we'll talk about this more later because this occurs throughout your life, but it starts in puberty. In the male, LH and FSH trigger testosterone production, and then testosterone mostly does the rest of the work. So then testosterone is responsible for sperm production, as well as the formation of what we call secondary sex characteristics that identify someone as male. We'll touch on this in a little bit more detail later, but it is all in this little slide, so you can refer back to this as a good review. In females, LH and FSH trigger estrogen production in the ovaries, and they do a lot of other things that we'll talk about later. And estrogen is mostly responsible for secondary sex characteristics that identify people as female, as well as being the primary hormone that drives development and release of eggs. So we'll talk about all this stuff down here as we go through the adult reproductive systems, but in that, in that's the end of your first decade and your second decade of life, that's when all of this kick starts. Okay, so this is a nice review slide of the hormones of the reproductive system, but it is specifically about puberty. All right, so secondary sexual characteristics and stuff. This is the words of the last slide. All right, so puberty is defined as a stage of development that ends in sexual maturity. And what gets mature is your gonads and your secondary sexual characteristics. So male secondary sexual characteristics are going to be an increase in muscular size. So testosterone drives muscle development. You get an increase in larynx size as well, and that's responsible for the deepening of the voice. Now that does actually, to some extent, occur in all people, but it's much more pronounced in men most of the time. So you get a deepening of your voice because literally your vocal cords have grown. And then testosterone also drives the growth of body hair. So this is where we get a much higher percentage of terminal hair. So that's the thicker, coarser, more pigmented hair. In men, it covers the majority of their bodies. It's a lot more variable in women. So those are the major secondary sexual characteristics. We're also seeing development of your reproductive organs. We'll get to that. In women, estrogen is driving these secondary sexual characteristics. A lot of them are based on specific sites of fat deposition. So this tends to predominantly be in the breast tissues as well as the hips. We're going to see breast development. So we'll talk very briefly about mammary glands at the end of this. But there is a difference between depositing fat in your breast and actually developing your breast tissue for the purpose of lactation. We also see terminal hair, usually, although this is variable, with a focus on your axillary, so your armpits and your pubic regions. And then we see a broadening of the pelvis, which goes along with the fat deposition. So we're seeing the shape of the coxal bones, especially ideally being shallower and with a wider pelvic canal for childbirth. Although there's, of course, a large variety in how all of that happens. And although I don't have it on the slide, I should add that we usually have a thickening of bones that goes along with the muscular development in men. It's kind of a 50-50 thing. So when you have more muscle strength, it's going to cause the bones to thicken to support them, but also the testosterone is going to drive increased growth and skeletal development as well. All right, so that's your kind of brief, how did we get here? So now we're going to go through the first male and then the female reproductive system. We'll do the anatomy and then we'll do the physiology. And honestly, we're probably going to go a little bit over time, but this way it all gets fit in today. And then we can review on Wednesday. Okay, so anatomy of the reproductive system. So anatomy is going to involve the gonad and then the secondary sex organs. Don't mistake secondary sex organs for secondary sexual characteristics, okay? They're different. So in men, the gonads are the testes. They lie outside of the body cavities within a sac of skin called the scrotum. We'll go through all of that anatomy. And then all of the secondary sex organs in men are ducts and glands, whose purpose is to give the sperm an exit and as well as a bunch of support. So we'll be going through these ducts one at a time, but from the testes to outside are the epididymis, the ductus deferens, which has a bunch of names, talk about that, the ejaculatory duct and the urethra, and then the supporting glands. We have a pair of seminal glands, a prostate gland, and a bulbourethral glands, pair of bulbourethral glands. And we'll go through all of those in more detail. This is just your overview. So we're going to start at the gonads and work our way out. This is our overview anatomy showing all of those things that I just described. So we're going to start with the testes here in the scrotum. The epididymis is here. The deferent duct runs into the body, over the bladder, joins up with some glands, and then into the urethra, and then the urethra goes all the way out. Prostate here, seminal glands up here, bulbourethral glands here. And then the penis is, of course, shared between the urinary and reproductive systems because of the urethra is shared. But most of the features of the penis are for the reproductive system. So we'll talk about that as well. All right, so we're going to start with the testes and the scrotum, because we're kind of going to follow the path that sperm will take from development to ejaculation. So the scrotum is a sac of skin, as well as some connective tissue fascia that is outside of the pelvic cavity. It sits at the root of the penis. So it's just inferior and posterior to the base of the penis where it attaches to the body, and it contains paired testes. Okay, we always at least start with 2 gonads. Now the testes are separated by a connective tissue septum, so they're in separate compartments, and there are several layers to the scrotum. So we have skin. This is typically haired skin. It contains sweat glands, lots of sensory receptors as well. And then the deeper layer is a smooth muscle. It's called the dartos muscle. And then there's a couple of layers of connective tissue. And then there's also some skeletal muscle here called the cremaster. The cremaster is actually a little bit of the internal oblique, which is one of the abdominal muscles. And we'll talk about the functions of all this stuff as we go through. So here's our anatomy diagrams. So this is showing you the skin without the hair. And it's showing you that the separation between the right and left testicular compartments is visible even from the outside. So we call that the median raphe, which is the septum. If we take off those layers, we can see the skeletal muscle or cremaster muscle lying outside the testes. And we've got some separating fascial layers, and then here's the skin and the dartos. And then we're going to talk about the stuff in here after we finish up with the scrotum. So it's kind of a weird thing because, you know, the testes are required for reproductive purposes. We need the sperm to make new human beings, right? And so it seems weird that we would put something so reproductively important in such a vulnerable position. Why are they external? Well, there's a couple of different explanations. So the easy answer is that sperm require temperatures below core body temperature to properly develop. So at our normal core body temperature, we do not have sperm development. They have to be external to be cooler in order to actually make sperm. But we don't know why that is. Like, we have no idea why sperm require this lower temperature. And there's lots of theories. We do know that there are some species that can have internal testes, and you know, they're still around, but most species of mammals have external testes. It's a mystery, okay? So just so you know, that's kind of a weird thing. All right, so if they need to be at a certain temperature for sperm development, how do they stay that way? There are a couple of different thermoregulatory mechanisms that the scrotum uses to keep the testes at about 34 degrees Celsius. So body temperature, core body temperature of people is about 36 degrees Celsius, just to give you that. I know we usually work in Fahrenheit, but I've never bothered to do the math to change it out. So it's a couple of degrees cooler. All right, so that smooth muscle layer of the scrotum, the dartos muscle, it plays a major role in thermoregulation. In warmer weather, where the external surface of the body isn't necessarily as nice and cool, it tends to be very relaxed. So the whole scrotum is very loose and can kind of hang away from the body. But in cold weather, when it's too cold outside really for the testes to be happy, it contracts, and that keeps the entire scrotum and testes closer to the body wall so they can stay warmer from the core heat. It also thickens the scrotal skin by kind of wrinkling it all together, so we have more insulation around these testes. Additionally, the cremaster muscle is capable of elevating the testes, so pulling them as close into the body as possible in response to cold. Also, other stimuli where the testes might need more protection, but for thermoregulatory purposes when it's cold. And then there are sweat glands in the scrotal skin, so when it's hot, the scrotum is capable of sweating for evaporative cooling. There's one more thermoregulatory mechanism for the testes, but it's not part of the scrotum, so I will mention it later. All right, so the testes themselves are surrounded by two connective tissue tunics within the skin of the scrotum. So the tunica vaginalis is an outpocketing of the peritoneum. So remember, we learned about the peritoneum when we talked about the digestive system. So if you think about the parietal peritoneum kind of lining the abdominal cavity, and then the testes start internally and they have to descend into the scrotum. So what happens is the testes come out, and when they exit the body, they just take some peritoneum with them. All right, that's what the tunica vaginalis is. And it's called vaginalis because anything that kind of pooches out is an invagination. All right, so it's just the Latin for something sticking out of something else. So then the tunica albuginea is a dense connective tissue capsule surrounding that whole thing. So it's fibrous, very sturdy for protection. And then it basically forms the innermost layer of the scrotum. The tunica, sorry, I totally got that backwards. I'm so sorry. Let me erase that. Sorry, the tunica albuginea is inside, it's the outermost layer of the testes, not the innermost layer of the scrotum. Totally did that wrong. I don't know what I was thinking. Here. So it forms an outer capsule of the testes, and then it actually kind of has these inner septa that stick into the testes that organizes the entire thing into lobules. Within the lobules are the tubes that produce sperm. So they're these teeny tiny tubes. They're called the seminiferous tubules. Okay, I know seminiferous is a crazy word, but it mostly just means it makes sperm, okay? Like semen, and it's tubule because they're super tiny. So essentially, the testes are just a highly organized package of teeny tiny tubules that make sperm. All right, so here is the testicle. It's surrounded by this fibrous capsule, tunica albuginea, that kind of comes in to divide this up into lobules. And then surrounding that is this oh, there it is, tunica vaginalis, which is going to surround the whole thing. Okay. So there's a couple of different cell types that we need to be concerned with in the testes. Within the seminiferous tubules, we have spermatogenic cells, which are the stem cells that become sperm. And then we have sustentacular cells, which are basically supporting cells that help these stem cells become sperm. This means they like sustain the sperm. The old word is Sertoli cell, so we'll probably kind of use that just because sustentacular is kind of a long, hard word to say. But they mean the same thing, and the other thing you'll see them called is nurse cells. Outside of the tubules, we have interstitial endocrine cells. The old word is Leydig cells, and they're the ones that actually produce androgens, the most important of which is, of course, testosterone. So we have tubes that make sperm, and we have cells outside of that making testosterone. In between, we have a blood-testes barrier. So remember that the blood-brain barrier keeps neurons separated from their capillaries so that we're controlling the environment around these neurons. So the blood-testes barrier is kind of similar, but for very different reasons. So these sustentacular or Sertoli cells, they have these tight junctions that prevent most substances from the capillaries surrounding these tubules from entering the lumen of the tubules. So we're keeping the sperm separated from the blood, and there's two big reasons for that. One, because if there are any pathogens in the blood, we don't want them damaging the sperm. And the other is that once we make sperm, it is distinctly different from the person that made it. So it's possible for a person to have an immune response to their own sperm, and we can prevent that by preventing the immune cells in the blood from accessing them. Okay, so we're protecting the sperm not only from potential pathogens, but also from the immune system itself. So that's why the blood-testes barrier is there. Okay, so these Sertoli or sustentacular or nurse cells have a ton of really important jobs. So not only are they maintaining that blood-testes barrier, they also provide the nutrients as well as any endocrine signals for the dividing cells that are becoming sperm. They move the sperm towards the middle of the tube, so luminally means towards the middle, or the lumen, because that's where they're going to have to be when they're done so that they can exit the testes. They secrete testicular fluid, which is what the sperm are transported in. They will get rid of sperm that are not quite right, so they phagocytize faulty sperm, as well as excess cytoplasm. So the germ cells are like normal cell size, but sperm are really tiny. And so they actually lose most of their cellular contents in the process of becoming sperm. And all that excess stuff gets basically eaten by the Sertoli cells. And then they produce a bunch of chemical mediators that regulate spermatogenesis. The most important ones are a hormone called inhibin and androgen binding proteins, which actually bind to testosterone. Okay, so the seminiferous tubules are surrounded by cells that basically work like smooth muscle. So they're called myoid cells, but really you can just think of them as smooth muscle cells. And basically they just kind of squeeze the sperm out of the seminiferous tubules as it matures. And in order to get all the way out of the testes, the seminiferous tubules lead into straight tubules. They collect the sperm from all of the seminiferous tubules. They then lead into these guys called efferent ductules. Efferent because they're exiting the testes. And that's how we get into the next organ of the male reproductive system, which is the epididymis. The testes have, of course, blood and lymphatic and nerve supplies. So there's a testicular artery to each testes for nutrients, oxygen, and of course, hormones. And then the testicular veins have a special feature that make them part of the thermoregulatory system. Thermoregulation, there we go. So instead of just like a vein or two exiting, we have what's called the pampiniform venous plexus. So it's like a whole crazy spider web that's all the way around each testicular artery. And its job is to actually cool the blood in the arteries so that it's no longer body temperature by the time it enters the testes. So, and then it warms up the blood that's returning back to the body. It uses something called countercurrent heat flow, which basically means the testes is nice and cool. And so we have this really hot arterial blood coming down, and we have this cool venous blood going back up. And make it, that'll be more helpful. All right, venous blood going that way, arterial blood coming this way. And so basically the heat is exchanged between these two vessels. The artery gives the vein heat on the way down, and the hotter blood is taken back up into the body. So this keeps the testes nice and cool, and helps with all that thermoregulatory stuff for sperm production. So that's our final major thermoregulatory mechanism. The nerve supply is mostly sensory receptors, and then the autonomic nervous system is in charge of most of the output because it's going to the blood vessels and stuff. So everything running between the scrotum and the body runs in what's called the spermatic cord. So the spermatic cord is all of the nerve fibers, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, as well as the deferent duct which carries sperm, passing between the scrotum and the inguinal canal, which is the pathway back into the body. So the spermatic cord is up here, and the route between the scrotum and the body is the inguinal canal, which I have a picture of in a little bit, okay? All right, so before we actually hit the epididymis, which is this guy right here, we're gonna talk a little bit more about sperm. So let me just point out real quick, so the seminiferous tubules are all in here. The straight tubules collect all that sperm, and then these are the efferent ductules. It's got a different name right here, but that's what they are. And so that takes them into the epididymis, which is all of this stuff, okay? So before we talk about the epididymis though, let's talk about the sperm itself. If we were in a higher level class, we would actually talk about the whole developmental stages of sperm and stuff, and it's in your textbook if you're really curious and for some reason bored, which I highly doubt, so don't even worry about it. But we're skipping that, we don't have time for that. But we do need to talk just briefly about the sperm itself. So sperm are actually one of the tiniest cells in the body, and that's because they're highly specialized for their function. And their function is literally just delivery of DNA to an egg. And so they don't need very much else. So the DNA is contained within the head of the sperm. The head of the sperm has a little cap filled with enzymes called an acrosome. The enzymes help it penetrate the egg. There's a midpiece chock full of mitochondria to produce ATP, and that ATP powers the movement of the tail, which is the flagellum that it uses for mobility. So it looks like this. So the DNA is in here in the head, acrosome on top of that. The midpiece has the mitochondria, and then the rest of it is all the tail, the flagellum, okay, for motion, movement forward, hopefully. Ooh, sorry about that. Okay, so this one's a little bit repetitive because you're going to see it over and over again, but this is the path that the sperm takes. So once we get out of those seminiferous tubules through the straight tubules and the efferent ducts, we end up in the epididymis. And then in order to get out of the scrotum, the epididymis becomes the ductus deferens, or the deferent duct, or the vas deferens. It has a bunch of names. And then we'll get to these guys. Okay, so these are all, again, those accessory ducts or the secondary sex organs. So the epididymis is actually a single, very tightly coiled tube called the duct of the epididymis, which sits next to the testis in the scrotum. And I should point out, with the I, testis is singular, and the testes with the E, that's plural. So mostly we're going to be talking about plural, but that's the singular one testicle. So the epididymis has to do a couple of different things. So first, it's going to absorb any extra testicular fluid, which remember was being produced by those Sertoli or sustentacular cells. Provides nourishment for the sperm that are being stored there, because sperm storage is one of its major functions. And it's also the site of sperm maturation. So sperm are developed in the testes, but they mature in the epididymis. So any sperm that is ejaculated is actually coming from the epididymis rather than directly from the testes. And one of the reasons is because they don't know how to swim until they've hung out in the epididymis for a while. Okay, so storage is the big guy, and while they're being stored there, they are maturing, and any extra fluid is getting absorbed, and it's feeding them while they're at it. All right, so even though this is kind of a big blobby thing, it is actually a single coiled tube that then becomes a less coiled tube out of the scrotum. So the ductus deferens is the next step. It's also called the deferent duct or the vas deferens, and there's probably a couple of other ones too. Vas deferens is where we get the term vasectomy from, because this is the tube that gets cut when men get vasectomies. We literally just take out a little bit of this tube so that the sperm developing in the testes and maturing in the epididymis can't actually make it to the urethra for ejaculation. So it is part of the spermatic cord. Its job is to carry sperm through the inguinal canal into the pelvic cavity. It loops over the ureters in the bladder, and then it empties into a structure called the ejaculatory duct. The very end of the duct, the deferent duct, widens into something called an ampulla, and the ejaculatory duct is actually a combination of the end of the deferent duct and the duct coming from the seminal gland, which is one of our accessory glands. All right, so we go from the deferent duct, we make this ejaculatory duct with the seminal gland, and then we're going to empty into the urethra. So the bladder's here, and the urethra is right there, and then voila, we've emptied into the urethra, and there's the prostate, okay? So remember from the urinary system that there are 3 parts or regions to the male urethra, and they're named by their location. So the prostatic urethra is the part that runs through the prostate. The intermediate or membranous urethra is the part between the prostate and the penis. So it's basically exiting through the muscles of the pelvic floor. And then the spongy urethra is what we call the urethra as it runs through the penis. And the end of it is the external urethral orifice. That's the opening. So here again is our whole system. So we have the deferent duct, and it comes up, and remember there's 2 of them, right? So one on the right side and one on the left side of the penis. They actually loop over the pelvic bone. This is the inguinal canal, so it's traveling through the muscles of the abdominal wall. And then we're going over the bladder, over the ureter. So here's the ureter bringing urine into the bladder. And then this is the ampulla, so this is the part where it gets wider. This is the seminal gland. So this is one of our accessory glands that contributes fluid. So where these 2 join together, this is the ejaculatory duct. And then we're joining up with the urethra within the prostate, okay? So then this little bit of urethra here between the prostate and the penis is the membranous or intermediate urethra. And then the rest of it is spongy urethra from the base of the penis to the external urethral opening. All right, so the accessory glands are basically the ones that make semen. So they contribute a variety of fluids that accompany the sperm during ejaculation. And sperm plus accessory gland fluid, I think I have a slide, but whatever, equals semen. Okay, semen is sperm plus a bunch of stuff. So we have 2 seminal glands, we have 1 prostate, and 2 bulbourethral glands. The seminal glands are also called seminal vesicles. It's kind of their older name. And as you saw on the diagram, they are located on the posterior surface of the bladder. They produce a viscous alkaline fluid. So pH regulation is one of the jobs of the seminal fluid. Viscous means it's thick for a couple of different reasons. So there's lots of things in here. So for example, there's some fructose. The mitochondria use that to make ATP. There's some citric acid, which is really weird because, you know, I just told you it's alkaline and that's an acid, but it is, just go with it. There's enzymes. Prostaglandins are like localized hormones. Other substances that increase sperm motility and its ability to fertilize. And there's also a yellow pigment in there that fluoresces under UV. So this is what's responsible for making semen light up under black light. Don't worry about that too much. The seminal glands also make up the majority of the seminal fluid, 70% of semen by volume. The prostate. So we have a single prostate. It encircles the urethra, which can be a bad plan because the prostate tends to enlarge as men get older, and that can put pressure on the urethra and the bladder. So, you know, that was a bad setup, but it is the way it is. Prostatic fluid is milky, so it's white, slightly acidic, and it contains citrates, various enzymes, and something called prostate-specific antigen, which I only mention because that's the one that they test to see if you have prostate cancer. These compounds have a role in helping activate the sperm, and it's about 30% of the semen volume. Okay, so if you've done the math, that's about 100%. So you're thinking, but there's bulbourethral glands too. Yeah, there are. So the bulbourethral glands are tiny, and they really just make mucus. And the mucus is supposed to go first, okay? So the mucus lubricates the urethra for the semen, and it also neutralizes any traces of urine that might be remaining in the urethra because the urine would damage the sperm, okay? So the bulbourethral glands, their production or their secretions go first, and then everything else goes mixed together. All right, so here's another view. This is a posterior view. So this is the back of the bladder. Here are the deferent ducts coming in. See how they kind of hook over the ureters? And then here's the ampulla. And the seminal vesicles, they join up together in the ejaculatory duct, and then they join up with the urethra. The prostate has like all these little guys to empty the prostatic fluid. And then within the membranous or at the membranous part of the urethra are the little bulbourethral glands. They kind of sit in the muscles of the pelvic floor. Okay, so that's where those guys are. So that takes us to the semen, which is the mixture of sperm, the accessory gland secretions, as well as any testicular fluid that was not absorbed in the epididymis. So semen is essentially the transport medium for sperm. And its job is to provide fuel. So remember the fructose for ATP, so that those mitochondria in the mid-piece can make ATP. We want a nice balanced pH. and a variety of things to encourage movement of the sperm. And some of them have like antimicrobial properties, all sorts of things, okay? So basically semen helps sperm do its job. Okay, so that takes us to the penis, which is the copulatory organ. So copulation is, you know, sex. Its job is basically to deliver sperm into the female reproductive tract. And the penis, along with the scrotum, are what we call the external male genitalia. So basically the parts we can see from outside, or the parts that are outside of the body. The penis has several parts to it. So the root of the penis is the part attached to the body. The shaft of the penis is the majority of the length of the penis. It's also called the body of the penis, so don't get that confused with, you know, like your torso. And then the tip of the penis is also called the glans. The glans is covered with a prepuce, which is more commonly called a foreskin, which is just a loose skin covering, although many men don't have one because they've had it removed. We're not going to address that, but apparently it's actually quite controversial. It's not something I have had to deal with personally, so I didn't quite realize this, but if that's something that you're interested in, here's some articles. If you don't care, then just ignore it. All right, so internal anatomy of the penis is important for its function. So obviously the spongy urethra is running through there. And then there are 3 cylindrical bodies of erectile tissue. Erectile tissue is basically just a bunch of venous sinuses that can hold blood, okay? So there's a corpus spongiosum. Corpus means body, so cylindrical bodies. It surrounds the urethra, and we think its major job is to keep the urethra open during ejaculation. And then distally, so at the end of the penis, it widens out to form the internal structure of the glands. Proximally, it forms the bulb of the penis. I've got pictures, diagrams. And then the corpora cavernosa, so corpora is plural, because there's 2 of these guys. They make up the majority of the internal structure of the penis. They sit, what is that? Anterior, I don't know. Above, I'll point it out, above the corpus spongiosum and the urethra. Proximally, they form the crura of the penis. The crura are like little arms within the root. And they're actually anchored to the pubic arch so that the penis is well connected to the body. So the pubic arch being the actual part of the pelvis, front part. Okay, so here's some anatomical diagrams so we can actually visualize what we're talking about here. So this is a view from inferior, so like this is the anus, okay? The scrotum would be sitting here, but obviously it's been removed for visualization purposes. So the root of the penis then is where it's going to be attached. The crura are these little guys right here. The bulb of the penis should be that thing right there. So these are just kind of the bases of the erectile tissue. And then the urethra is running within this corpus spongiosum. So this is on the, the inferior aspect here. And then above that, we have these paired corpora cavernosa. And all of them are surrounded by dense connective tissue, also called the tunica albuginea, although it's not directly connected to the one around the testes, but it serves the same purpose, so they gave it the same name. And these contain the erectile tissue so that there's actually something, how do I put this? So you can actually get a good pressure in there, which is necessary for an erection. Let's see. Okay, so then, yeah, so then here's the body, and then this is the glands, and I don't think I have a good one of the foreskin. It's fine. All of this is covered in skin, and here you can kind of get a better look at how the blood vessels are arranged. Most of the major ones are on the superior aspect. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a better feel for that. And you can see how the corpora cavernosa make up the majority of the internal structure. Here's some other ones. This one is showing you how there's ligaments connecting the root of the penis, as well as showing you what's the word? It's showing you, you know, how it's sitting along with the scrotum. I guess that's what I was trying to say. But this is also a really nice one of the contents of the spermatic cord. So there's the spermatic cord there. This is the scrotal skin, so the testes are sitting right here. All right, divided. So you can kind of just see how all of the external anatomy is sitting, and then, oh no, sorry, that's not anything. The inguinal canals are up here, so they're not getting shown. Oh well, okay. And then this is just a different view of the erectile tissue in there. I don't know, I like to find multiple images in case it helps. All right, this is the same one again. I just throw it in regularly in case I missed something, but I think I covered most of that already. Although this one does show how the corpus spongiosum does expand to form the internal structure of the glands, so that's good. What else? What else? What else? Okay, so when we look at the external genitalia, and we're looking at this whole combined area of the genital, urinary, and digestive region, what we have is an area of the skin called the perineum. So the perineum contains the anus, the root of the penis, as well as the attachment point for the scrotum. We define it as a diamond-shaped region between the pubic symphysis, so pubic bone here, tailbone or coccyx back here, and then your ischial tuberosities, those are like your seat bones or your sit bones. So like if you sit on something very firm and you can feel your bones sitting on them, that's those guys. So like your anus is here. Everybody's got a perineum, but the exact arrangement depends on your reproductive organs. The floor of the perineum is formed by muscles. This is when we refer to the pelvic floor. We are talking about these guys. They literally hold up all of your internal organs from falling through the pelvic canal. It's kind of a big deal because they include the muscles of your external urethral sphincter and your external anal sphincter. So if damage happens or weakness occurs with those muscles, you can become incontinent, which is not related to the reproductive system at all, but this is when it comes up. Okay, so here's a diagram of the male perineum. So the diamond shape is kind of like this. All right, so your pelvic canal is basically here. So you can see the anus is right here and the root of the penis, and you can just kind of see how there's all of this muscle running through here. It almost looks like it's like woven in. Okay, and that's as far as we'll go with it, but just kind of pointing that out because it's important. All right, so physiology. I swear there was more hormone stuff, but I guess not. Well, maybe it's after this. Okay, physiology, male sexual response. All right, so we've talked about making the sperm and the pathway that it takes and the accessory organs and all that stuff, but we haven't talked about how we actually get all of that stuff out, right? So the male sexual response is the general term for how we get sperm out. So the first step is erection. And erection is, of course, of the penis, and it's actually achieved by a process called vasocongestion. So vasocongestion is the idea that we're now putting more blood into the erectile tissue of the penis than is leaving the erectile tissue, and that makes the penis rigid, and the rigidity is necessary for penetration into the vagina, which, as we'll talk about really soon right here, is the female copulatory organ. Sorry. All right, so the male sexual response has 2 phases to it. And this is, of course, highly simplified. Like, there's entire classes on this stuff. We're just covering the basics. So erection, which, as I said, vasocongestion, enlargement, and stiffening of the penis. This part is under parasympathetic control. Remember that I mentioned how most of the time the autonomic nervous system is in opposition, and this is one of those rare examples of dual innervation where they both help to do the same thing. So parasympathetic control for erection, because we relax the arterioles supplying the erectile tissue, that causes vasodilation. So we increase blood flow into the erectile tissues, and then the increased blood flow actually compresses the veins that would normally drain the tissue, and that's how we get that vasocongestion. So when we fill it with enough blood and we have those fibrous connective tissue capsules around them, basically, now we get this rigidity. And so because it's parasympathetic control, that means the central nervous system is involved. So anything that the central nervous system, anything that the central nervous system counts as sexual stimulation will trigger this. All right, so that's the first phase. Second phase is ejaculation. So ejaculation is defined as propulsion of semen from the male duct system. And in men, this is synonymous with, although technically different from, climax or orgasm. So this is a part under sympathetic control. It's a spinal reflex. So just like defecation and urination are spinal reflexes, so is ejaculation. And that's because, like swallowing, there's a lot to coordinate here. So we have to coordinate closing the bladder. So we have to get those bladder sphincters closed, the urethral sphincters. We're contracting the reproductive ducts and accessory glands, because we actually have to like move the sperm from the epididymis through the deferent ducts into the ejaculatory duct, into the urethra. We have to squeeze the fluid out of all of our accessory glands. And then we contract these guys called the bulbospongiosus muscles. So they're part of the pelvic floor muscles, and they're skeletal muscles. But again, this is a reflexive action. So it's not under voluntary control. So we contract the bulbospongiosus muscles, and that's going to actually propel the ejaculate, so the semen that's in the urethra, out. And I don't have good diagrams of that. All I have is diagrams of a flaccid penis, so a penis that is not engorged with blood, versus an erect penis, so one that is engorged with blood. Which is, you know, they put more red in here. No, that's not the only difference. So what they're showing you here is dilation of the arteries, allowing more blood flow, and then they've technically drawn these veins as being smaller because they're being compressed, so we're decreasing the outflow. So that's what they're drawn in there. All right, last thing here is regulation. I don't know why I put it here. I should have put it earlier, but whatever. Okay, so back to the hypothalamus and pituitary and gonad thing. So when we talk about this regulation, it's this interaction between the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and whichever gonad we're talking about, which in this case is, of course, the testes. And this hormonal axis regulates the production both of the gametes, so in this case the sperm, and the sex hormones, which mostly in this case is testosterone. All right, so this is where we finally see what does FSH and LH actually do in the male reproductive system. All right, so testosterone is, of course, our major hormone of the male reproductive system. It is a steroid hormone, so that means that it was synthesized from cholesterol. It actually activates specific genes, but you don't really need to worry about that part. We've talked about how it influences secondary sexual characteristics. Within the testes itself, it is actually produced by those Leydig cells, those interlobular endocrine cells, whenever they have LH. So luteinizing hormone, or LH, stimulates testosterone production. The testosterone promotes sperm production as well as having all of those anabolic effects. And it is necessary for the proper function of the male reproductive system. This gets regulated through that hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So the gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus acts on the anterior pituitary for FSH and LH release. The LH causes testosterone production by the Leydig cells, and the levels produced are controlled by negative feedback, which means that the testosterone is going to inhibit production of GnRH and LH directly. And then the follicle stimulating hormone, the FSH, acts on the Sertoli cells. So within the seminiferous tubules, we're encouraging spermatogenesis by encouraging these nurse cells. And the levels of FSH released are controlled by inhibin. So inhibin acts to literally inhibit FSH release. Like, they just named it because it's an inhibiting hormone, okay? The way that we get the testosterone in here is because the Sertoli cells are also making that androgen binding protein. And so that binds the testosterone to help promote spermatogenesis within the tubules. So this is what that looks like. GnRH, FSH, LH. So the LH goes to these interstitial endocrine cells, that's what it was called, and we get testosterone release. The testosterone negatively feeds back on the pituitary and the hypothalamus, so that's how we control testosterone levels and keep them relatively stable. And we get high concentrations within the seminiferous tubules because the Sertoli cells are making androgen binding protein. FSH is going to stimulate that androgen binding protein release, so then the testosterone is able to stimulate the testosterone stimulates the spermatogenesis, so sperm production, and then the inhibin released by that is what negatively feeds back for FSH, okay? So we have these negative feedback loops. We're maintaining fairly steady levels of testosterone, and if they drop, then all of these inhibitions drop. We get release of more of these guys, and we go through it all again, okay? So this is how male reproductive systems are maintaining solid testosterone levels for male reproductive function. Reminder and a couple of extra things. So testosterone is necessary for the growth of accessory reproductive organs. So for full development of all the ducts, glands, as well as the penis that we talked about, we need testosterone. We also need it for all those secondary sexual characteristics. So the body hair we talked about, the voice deepening. It also tends to make the skin thicker and increases sebum production, so oilier. It increases the basal metabolic rate, as well as driving libido. So increasing the basal metabolic rate means you literally have a higher metabolism. And then it has these somatic effects, which is what we call the increasing growth of bone and muscle development. Okay, so that's testosterone. All right, so this is this little summary of the male reproductive system. Now we're going to talk about female. This is taking much longer than I thought. I apologize. We might do a little bit of, we'll finish this up on Wednesday and then we'll review, I think is what's happening, because I thought it wasn't going to run quite this long. All right, so let's go through the anatomy of the female reproductive system and see where we're at. All right, so just like the male reproductive system, we have a variety of both internal and external anatomy. The internal genitalia include the ovaries, the oviducts, the uterus, and the vagina. And then the external genitalia is collectively called the vulva, and it includes all these things on the list, but we'll cover them when we get there. I don't really feel like I need to read them all out loud. Okay, so here's a little diagram. Paired ovaries, paired oviducts or uterine tubes, single uterus, single vagina. Okay, that's all the internal stuff. We need better diagrams for the external stuff. I'll show you guys later. All right, and then this is looking at it from the other view, but you can't see the ovaries because they're off to the side, and this is a mid-sagittal view. So this is just showing you the body of the uterus. The cervix is right here. This is essentially the sphincter that controls the entryway into the uterus, and then here's the vagina. Oh, and then this is the bladder and the urethra. Okay, we'll start with the ovaries just like we started with the testes. So they are intraperitoneal, as in they're in the same body cavity as your digestive system. Paired gonads. They sit lateral to the uterus, so to the right and the left. They are anchored by ligaments inside the body to kind of keep them in place. So there's an ovarian ligament medially. It connects the ovary to the uterus. And then the broad ligament supports all of our internal genitalia. So it supports the ovaries, the oviduct, and the uterus. And it suspends everything laterally. So we have a right and a left broad ligament. It's also called the mesovarium. And it's kind of just like a sheet on either side. So it kind of works like this, okay? So ovary. This is the ovarian ligament. It connects the ovary to the uterus. And then all of this stuff is the broad ligament, and this is cut, actually. It goes up to the posterior body wall, just like the mesentery connects the digestive system. The ovaries have a couple of different layers to them. So there is an outer fibrous layer, just like the testes. So we also call it the tunica albuginea. And it's covered by something called the germinal epithelium, but really that's just the visceral peritoneum, okay? And then as far as the functional parts of the ovary, there's a cortex, an outer cortex, which contains the gametes. So that's the eggs or ova. And then the inside is the medulla, and that's where all the blood vessels and the nerves run. So we have this little core of blood vessels and nerves, and then we have all of this tissue where the eggs can develop. And then all of that is surrounded by a nice little fibrous capsule, okay? Egg development is a little different from sperm development. So whereas with sperm, and I forgot to say this before, we are constantly making sperm. So Once men hit puberty and sperm development starts, it basically never stops. It's continuous, and you just keep making sperm. But eggs don't work like that. There's a limited number of eggs, and they get developed every month during a cycle that we'll talk about, I suspect, on Wednesday. And they have their own set of supportive cells. So they sit in little guys called follicles. That's the structure surrounding each egg. And they have little support cells or follicular cells. And we'll talk more about what granulosa cells are when we talk about the cycle. I just find lots of pictures, okay? So here's another one. The blood vessel supply is crazy. All right, so the duct system is a bit different. So unlike in the male, where the ducts are literally continuous, right? We have a direct connection between the testes and the epididymis. Here, we don't have a continuous connection. It's very, very odd. So instead, the first part of the duct system, or which is the oviducts, fallopian tubes, uterine tubes, whatever you want to call them. I prefer oviducts, but I see uterine tubes a lot. Instead, they actually have to catch the oocytes when they're ovulated. So the ovary literally ovulates an oocyte into the peritoneal cavity, and the little oviduct has to catch it. Now, luckily, the end of the oviduct is quite wide, and it has all these little finger-like projections on it. So this wide opening of the oviduct is called the infundibulum, and the little finger-like projections are called fimbriae. And it kind of works like a catcher's mitt in baseball. So most of the time, it's going to catch the egg. So there's the beginning of it, and then there's an ampulla in the middle. I'm pretty sure is the site of ovulation. And then at the end of the duct is the isthmus, and then it empties into the uterus. And this also has connections. So the part of the broad ligament that suspends the uterine tubes is called the mesosalpinx, because salpinx is like the super Latin-y term for uterine tube. All right, so that takes us to our next internal organ, which is the uterus. So the uterus sits between the rectum and the bladder within the pelvic cavity. And its function is to receive, retain, and nourish a fertilized oocyte, ideally until it is a full-grown fetus and it's ready to be born. There's anatomy to the uterus, so the majority of it is the body. The little part that sticks up is the fundus, and then there's an isthmus and a cervix. The cervix has a cervical canal, which empties into the vagina. A variety of supporting structures keep the uterus in place. So most of it is broad ligament, so mesometrium. All right, so now we've talked about all the broad ligament structures. So the broad ligament has the mesovarium, the mesosalpinx, and the mesometrium, suspending these different internal organs. There's also cardinal ligaments, uterosacral ligaments, and round ligaments, and all of them help keep the uterus in place and connect to various parts of the body wall. So here you can really see these fimbriae, and then we come down here, and the ampulla is in there somewhere, and then the infundibulum. I don't know why, but I always get these mixed up. Infundibulum to ampulla to isthmus. Yeah, it's the eyes. Sorry. So infundibulum, nice wide part for catching, and then the ampulla in the middle. And then the isthmus is this narrow bit down here, and then we're emptying into the uterus. So here's the fundus of the uterus, body, isthmus, again, little narrow tapering bit, and then cervical canal and cervix. So again, the cervix is basically the sphincter of the uterus. Now the uterus also has layers, and it's kind of like the stomach, to be honest, similar. So the perimetrium is the serous membrane. It forms the outermost layer, and it's the same as the visceral peritoneum. The myometrium is 3 layers of smooth muscle. It makes up the majority of the thickness of the wall. And then the innermost layer is the endometrium. So the endometrium is the epithelial layer that lines the lumen, as well as the lamina propria, which is the supporting connective tissue layer. The epithelium has 2 parts to it, or 2 layers. There's the stratum basale, or the base layer. And then there's the stratum functionalis, and this is the part that can be variable based on the hormones. And we'll talk about that as we go through the cycle. All right, so the perimetrium's out here, myometrium is here, and then the endometrium is in here. Stratum basale is down here, and then stratum functionalis is up there. This is just showing you how there's 3 different muscle layers. So there's a longitudinal, a circular, and then there's fibers arranged in more of a figure 8. And of course, the reason why we have all of this muscle here is because the fancy term is parturition, or childbirth. Okay, so in order to expel the fetus, actually get a baby out, we're gonna have to have some good muscle in here. Here's another one showing you the endometrium. You can refer back to this one after we go through the cycle as well. But basically just showing you the basal layer, and then that the functional layer is variable. All right, so the last internal organ is the vagina. The vagina is the connection between the uterus and the external genitalia. It is a thin-walled tube. There is some muscle in there. Its functions are copulation and birth. So basically it is the entrance and exit to the uterus. Even though I know I said the cervix is, but the cervix is the sphincter and the vagina is the tube connecting it. Interestingly, the vagina lacks glands of its own. It is lubricated by cervical mucus, as well as exudate. So the vaginal walls just kind of filter a little bit of fluid out of the blood, and that's what lubricates the vaginal walls. That fluid actually includes glycogen. So the epithelial cells secrete glycogen, and it deliberately feeds a microbiome of its own. It's totally separate from the microbiome in your gut. That microbiome is mostly lactobacilli, which are bacteria that make lactic acid. And that lactic acid maintains a fairly acidic environment to the vagina, which prevents the growth of bacteria that would cause problems and helps keep it free of infection. So just like we have good bacteria in our gut, mostly in our large intestine, so too we have good bacteria in the vagina. The vagina also has layers, but it's more similar to the esophagus. So it's outside of the pelvic cavity, so there's no serosal layer. Instead, it's got an adventitia, so connective tissue that anchors it to the adjacent structures. There is a muscularis, or smooth muscle layer, and then we have a stratified squamous epithelium forming the mucosa, because this is an opening to the outside. So we have a mucous membrane with a stratified squamous epithelium for protection. There are folds or texture to that surface, so we call them rugae, just like we call the folds in the stomach rugae. All right, so cervix, vagina, you can see they made it quite thin compared to the thickness of the uterus, and they're showing you those folds in here, so the rugae, and this is showing you that stratified squamous epithelium. This is a photograph of a cadaver dissection showing you that it's pretty much the same when it's real. So they are drawing these from something fairly accurate. So the ovaries down here, ovarian ligament, uterine duct with the fimbriae, uterus, cervix, and vagina. All right. I don't know why I felt the need to put an additional one, but there's another one too. You know, whichever diagrams work for you. All right, so external genitalia is the rest of it. So once we get past vagina, everything else is external genitalia. And we collectively refer to all of the external genitalia of the female reproductive system as the vulva. And this does bring me very briefly to a pet peeve, which is the fact that you can't see a vagina from the outside, okay? The only way to see a vagina from the outside is with a special medical speculum, all right? Otherwise, if you see female reproductive organs from the outside, what you're seeing is a vulva. It's kind of one of those things. Okay, so there's a bunch of parts to it. So the mons pubis, or the pubic mound, is the skin and adipose that sits on the, what would that be? The anterior aspect of the vulva. It's usually haired, although that can obviously be altered by taking the hair off, which is cultural. There are two sets of what we call lips. So labia majora are skin, haired on the outside. Labia minora are a much thinner skin, not haired. So these guys are basically, make those up, yep, like that. Basically, they're framing the opening to the internal genitalia. The glans clitoris sits up there. It's easier if I just get to the diagram. I've got stuff on all of these guys. There's some glands in here, the hymen. The urethral opening is between the glans clitoris and the vaginal opening or orifice, okay? So men have two exits, right? Urethra and anus. Women have three: urethra, vagina, and anus. Yeah, I should have just gone to this. Okay, so the pubic mound is here. The outer lips, the labia majora, are here, and then the labia minora are here. So the clitoris is here, or this is technically the glans clitoris. I'll cover that more in a moment. And there is a little clitoral hood that covers it, which is analogous to the prepuce of the glans penis. So here's the urinary opening. This is the urethral opening here. This is the vaginal opening. Okay, technically you can see a little bit of vagina, but you gotta like pull everything open. The glands, and I'll talk more about those in a minute, kind of sit like this. They're internal though, like you can't actually see them, they're under the skin. And of course, here's the anus down here just for orientation. Okay, so that's external genitalia, again, collectively referred to as a vulva. Okay, so the hymen, that's another one of those things that gets talked about a lot, or well, not really, but you know what I mean. So the hymen is considered a variable partial covering over the vaginal orifice. It's not supposed to be like fully covering it, because if it was, then nothing could come out. And since there's a regular amount of secretions that should be exiting, that would be really bad. And then, sorry, cat. And then since women after puberty, or during and after puberty, menstruate on approximately a monthly basis, that would be really bad too. There are a lot of myths surrounding the hymen. So for example, usually it does not change following vaginal intercourse. So hymens are not supposed to break, rupture. They stretch a little bit, but they kind of just bounce into place. So that means that the appearance of the hymen can't actually be used to determine if a woman has had vaginal intercourse before. There is no way to tell, because none of the external genitalia or the vagina is going to significantly change following vaginal intercourse. Pretty much no matter how much of it there is, because that's what it's all made for. And so it's made to be quite stretchy and bounce back. If it is completely covering the vaginal orifice, it's called an imperforate hymen. It needs to be opened because, like I said, there's secretions and menstrual shedding that must come out. So that's the only time where you would deliberately modify a hymen, is because you need to let all that stuff come out. Otherwise, you're going to get like a horrible infection. Be so bad. Ugh. The reason why there's a hymen is because when the internal genitalia form, they form from the inside out. And when the external genitalia form, they kind of form from the surface in. And the hymen is literally the location where the vagina meets up with the vaginal orifice. And so you kind of just end up with this variable amount of tissue there. And that's the hymen. It's just because they're kind of like tunneling towards each other and then they open. And so sometimes you just get a little bit of stuff there. There's lots of different appearances to it because it really doesn't serve a purpose. It's basically just a developmental remnant. And so this is just a diagram showing different appearances of it. And that's the publication that I pulled that image from. Okay, so if you have questions about any of that, here's a couple of good resources about it. Just like circumcision, this is something that has a lot of potential misinformation around it. So there you go. Next part, the clitoris. So the visible part of the clitoris is the glans. This is the same thing basically as the glans penis. And just like the glans penis has a prepuce, there's skin folds covering the glans clitoris as well. It's called the clitoral hood. The clitoris has a ton of sensory nerve endings. I believe it's technically the same amount as a glans penis, but in a much smaller space. So it's much higher concentration. And as far as we can tell, the clitoris is the only human organ whose sole function is pleasure, which is quite curious. A lot of people kind of look at it as, well, it's just that, you know, when you don't make a penis, you still have that tissue, but we don't need to have one, and we do anyway. So that's kind of cool. But when we look at it, we realize that just like there's more parts to a penis than the glans, there's more parts to the clitoris as well. It really is equivalent to all the tissues of the penis, but instead of, you know, forming an external organ, it surrounds the external genitalia under the skin, as well as the opening into the vagina. So the only part that's actually visible is right here. And then we have a bunch of other things that are equivalent to the penis. So we have the body of the clitoris, we have the crus, so these are the crura, just like the crura of the penis that I pointed out to you. We have the same erectile tissue as well. So we have, this is all corpus cavernosum. And then this should be equivalent to the corpus spongiosum as well. And so that means that during arousal, these will also become engorged, just like the erectile tissue of a penis. Okay, so there are also glands for the external genitalia. They're homologous to the prostate and bulbourethral glands. As far as I know, there are no homologs to the other guys. Oh my God. Seminal glands, sorry. But they're both paired. They both have a bunch of different names, but we'll just go with the ones that I put in bold, okay? So the periurethral glands, because they sit on either side of the urethral opening, secrete a similar fluid to the prostate, although they're much smaller and they secrete a lot less fluid. And then the greater vestibular glands secrete mucus, like the bulbourethral glands, although again, they're tiny, and they have openings to either side of the vaginal orifice. We don't know if, like, we don't know how important their functions are, or if they really are just like, you know, well, in men, this would be something very important because it contributes to semen, and we make these and maybe they kind of help with lubrication or something like that. We're not really sure like how important they are because they're fairly tiny, but we have them. Oh, sorry. Okay, so the openings to the periurethral glands are like here, and then the openings to the greater vestibular guys are right there. Bartholin's and Scenes are the old names where they, you know, some guy named them after himself. All right, this is just, I think this is one in your book. So this one's nice because it shows you both. This is essentially, you know, the actual view of the external genitalia, right? External anterior view. And then this is showing you without the skin so that you can see what the underlying structures are. Female perineum, so all the same muscles. And here's the anus again for reference. Here's the diamond. I didn't have a slide defining it because it's the same thing, okay? But here's the clitoris, urethral opening, and vaginal orifice. And again, these muscles are very important. They hold all the organs up. They include your external anal sphincter, and your external urethral sphincter. And they also include muscles surrounding the vagina. So they're important for continence. Okay, I guess we're finishing this up on Wednesday. So on Wednesday, we're going to talk about the female reproductive physiology, which is pretty much cycles and cycles and cycles. Please read the slides and or the book before that because it will help if you're not hearing it for the first time on Wednesday. And then we will do review of the 3 systems that we covered that will be on your exam at the end of this week. Okay, and then we can tackle the beginning of final exam review, but again, there will be another review on Monday for that. All right, so before we go, does anyone have any questions? Hopefully not. Hopefully you would have asked them as we were going. I will see people on Wednesday. Please email me if you have questions in between Zoom sessions. All right. Hope your week starts well. I know there's a lot going on. We're almost done though. Okay.